Welcome everybody again to the Board Development and Governance webinar. This is the advanced track. Before I introduce our speaker, just a few more housekeeping items. We want to do an Indigenous land acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge that we live and work in territories where Indigenous nations and tribal groups are traditional stewards of the land. Our California office resides in the Tongva territory. Please join us in supporting efforts to affirm tribal sovereignty across what is now known as California and displaying respect, honor, and gratitude for all Indigenous people. You can learn more with these three options we have listed here. Just a quick overview of our wonderful team. We have so much wealth of experience and expertise. So if you ever need any support, please do reach out to us. We're here to help. Now I'd like to go over our community agreements. The first one is be present and be an active listener. So I know the desire to multitask. I totally know, and you have lots of things going on, but really do try to be present because you don't want to miss any nugget of information that could help your organization. One mic, one voice. So please take turns. If somebody's speaking, please be patient for your chance to speak up. Practice inclusivity. So recognizing that we all come from different backgrounds and experiences. Just know that it's, recognizing that we want to be inclusive of all those different backgrounds. Honor pronouns and gender identity. If anybody shares that, please respect that. And if you're not sure, ask. And show respect overall. And know that may look different for other people. So just if you don't know, again, always ask. Allow conflicting perspective to exist. So it's okay if somebody doesn't agree with you. Remember, they may just be coming from different experiences. So use inquiry at any time when you're not sure. Feel like, how can that person feel that way? Just ask questions. Assume best intentions. Keeping in mind, we all are coming here to learn. So just always assume that first and foremost. Take space and make space. So please do speak up when there's a chance to do so, but make sure you're allowing other people to do the same. Share what you're comfortable sharing, and at the same time, protect individual privacy. We want you to share your stories, but only share what you're comfortable with. And then as you're leaving this space, just, take away the learnings. You don't have to be sharing the stories. Practice self-care. Please get up and use the restroom if you need to, stretch, whatever you need to do, take care of yourself. Encourage growth of self and for others. Again, like I said, we're all here to learn. So really encourage that for yourself and others. And one way that you could do that is by sharing resources and asking people to share their resources as well. So just a reminder of our 2-track event. This is new that we separated out to 2 separate events, same time, same day. But just to go overview, those people that are here, making sure you're in the right place. The learning goals for today, which Robin, our presenter, will go in more depth. When and how to update bylaws, how to review, update board member job descriptions, improving executive director and board president chair relationship, and improving board meetings. So people here, we're assuming are individuals from nonprofits that are at least 5 years old and have at least 5 years of experience, and also board members. So without further ado, I'm very excited to introduce our presenter, Robin Payson. Robin has an extensive background in working both in mental health as well as substance use disorder. She's the former executive director of Communities for Recovery, as well as executive director for NAMI Texas. In 2013, she founded her own consulting firm, and her focus is on peer-based substance use and mental health recovery services and support. So without further ado, Robin, it is my pleasure to introduce you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today and to talk about something that's kind of, I'm sort of nerdy, near and dear to my heart, which is board development and board governance, because from my experience, it's just critical to the success of your organization and nonprofit. So by the end of this training, as Rachel covered, you're going to know and when how to update your organization's bylaws, provide some guidance on why is it so important for the board to be involved in fundraising, and what are some structures you can put into place to do that more effectively. If you've been doing this work for 5 years, you know that there can be wonderful relationships and tension between board chairs and executive directors. We're going to be talking a little bit about what are some steps that can be put into place that help produce an effective working relationship. And then last, we're going to talk a little bit about board development. I'm a big fan of looking at organizations and where they are in their developmental stages. And in doing that, what should boards be doing at those different developmental stages? So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So just what I went over, this is the areas we're going to be discussing today. So should you be reviewing your bylaws? It's actually, a lot of people, and you may have been one of them. I was at the very beginning of my career in working with nonprofits. I was, bylaws just seemed like a lot of words, and a document that, maybe you looked at occasionally, but it wasn't something that provided to me a foundation. And now, now that I've been doing this work for quite a few years, I really believe how important it is to have good bylaws. And I learned that in some ways the hard way. For example, when I was supporting some, affiliates, when I was executive director of NAMI Texas, when affiliates would call and they were experiencing serious issues within their organization, one of the first things I said is, when was the last time you reviewed your bylaws, and two, are you using them? Because they really do give you a roadmap for successful organizational function. And so they end up being really critical. So you also, they're not a static document. And what do I mean by that? They're something that you can't just read once and put on the shelf and forget. There's something that, that you need to be having a process in place to take a look at them and look at what changes have happened in your organization and in your environment. So start looking at, when you're thinking about bylaws, what's, do you have the right number of board of directors, for example? Did you start out small when you were founding your organization, and now you really need more representation from your community? Do you need to expand the number to be more effective? Or are you having trouble keeping up with the work? Do you need a different skill set? So you need to expand and recruit board members in that skill set? Or has your service area changed so that now you're representing communities that you weren't originally? A lot of times you start out, you open an office, then you're opening a satellite office, and you're serving, beyond your city or more than one county, but your board is not reflective of that. So you really need to be looking at, how do you make sure as a nonprofit you're rooted in your community and you have representation? Your election procedures. With COVID, so many things came online and people were struggling with some of those issues. Like, do you have election procedures that meet your needs right now? And do you have to be in person, for example? Do you have some ways to manage that electronically or digitally? Quorum requirement is a big thing, which can change with virtual attendance. Are they meshed so that they reflect each other so you can work effectively? So very clear about how to remove a director. That's a really sticky issue. And it really helps to have a clear process ahead of time before you're running into the issue. Otherwise, you run into the issue and it's always difficult. And can you put some teeth into it? So let's say someone says, I really want to serve on your board of directors. And you have a policy that says you have to attend a certain number of meetings to be on the board of directors. And then you have someone who is a repeated violator and really can't, either intentionally or just because they have struggled with the commitments of the work on their plate, don't show up and participate. You have something in place that says, thank you so much for your service, but it's clear you can't give us the time and energy that we need. So we're asking you to step down. We're asking you to put in your resignation because they don't come. And then methods of communication or messaging. Again, a lot of things changed with COVID. And so, what does your bylaws allow you to do around voting and virtual meeting rules? So why do you need to do that? Well, the buck stops with the board. What do I mean by that? You have fiduciary responsibilities, you have accountability responsibilities, you have legal responsibilities as a board that should be taken very seriously. And if you are operating outside of your states or regulations around bylaws, which can change, typically after a legislative session, there may be changes that have been introduced into your state code on not-for-profit regulations. And you know, it's helpful to keep up with that. So you want to ensure you're in legal compliance. Issues that have come up, especially more recently, as I mentioned, is voting on the board's actions by email, or committees that include non-directors being authorized with powers of the board. So what do I mean by that? So sometimes nonprofits invite non-board members to serve on committees. It's actually a great way to kind of see if it's a good match for future board members, to see if someone can be effective in following through on the assignments to the committees, or but they don't have board powers. And so you have to be sure that when they're making decisions, that the committee knows they're recommending those decisions for approval by the board, not exceeding their power of authority, because that puts you at legal risk. You want to ensure that you have legal compliance with internal governance practices. So what do I mean by that? Your bylaws specify when your board meets, how it should meet, how voting occurs, all those internal governance practices. And if you are not following, you know, worst case scenario, your board doesn't follow that. You make a decision. That decision has a negative impact on, let's say you're approving a contract and you don't follow your decisions. And then someone comes along and they're very unhappy that you approve someone else to have a contract. And they request in an open records, they want to see, how did you come to that decision? You know, if you can't demonstrate that you followed your own bylaws and processes, then you have put your organization at legal risk. Well, and also it's just effective governance. You want to be an organization that is governed effectively. And what does that mean? That means that you routinize certain governance procedures and ensure that you're performing effectively. You should be looking at, again, your elections is one of the areas, or when do you hold your elections? Most times people set an anniversary date. So, you know, depending on your calendar year, if it's a fiscal year or January to December, you set a specific time and you follow those, you know, that calendar. And you really need to be looking at ineffective government practices. And so what do I mean by that? How many of you have ever sat in a board meeting where you felt that it wasn't run very effectively? You know, kind of raise your hand if you've ever been in a board meeting. So, you know, how do you make a board meeting more effective? Well, you look at how is it run. So the standard used to be Robert's Rules of Order. There's now something actually called Roberta's Rules of Order, which it was a new topic for me. I enjoyed reading about that. There are actually now some have come into more recent use of larger organizations and for-profit organizations, and maybe some larger nonprofit, where you can get board management software that helps you, especially for meetings that are running digitally or electronically, that helps you sort of manage it according to your bylaws and processes. So, you know, basically the board is responsible for the effective board meetings, for many things, but effective board meetings, and for fiduciary responsibilities, and making sure your board meetings are run well is a big part of that. So it's useful to have board members kind of be familiar with what their responsibilities are. So we talked a little bit about directors removal. You should be following your own processes for that, the internal and external liability. And then let's get to organizational dissolution. That should be actually spelled out when you have dispute that can't be resolved. Sometimes an organization may be dissolved by court decision. I'd like to tell you boards never get to that point, but that's not true. Sometimes there can be such a high degree of conflict and lack of agreement that especially when it includes court cases, that nonprofits can be ordered to be dissolved. And there actually is criminal liability. It behooves us as board members and nonprofits to make sure that we're staying on the right side of the law, because there can be criminal liability. And I bet you most of you've been doing this and you're in this track because it's advanced, can think of examples in your state or your community where there was criminal liability. I would say it wasn't. Maybe like 10 years ago, there was an infamous case in Austin. I'm in Texas, so in the central Austin, Texas area, where it turned out that this executive director was committing very, very, very significant fraud. And she left the country and left the nonprofit. And it was that the board, it turned out she was manufacturing financial statements. And it actually, I thought this was amusing. It was discovered because two women, a staff person and someone who had used to do the auditing for that organization, ran into each other at the gym. And the staff member mentioned off the cuff, how is that audit coming? And the woman who was the accountant auditor said, well, we haven't audited your statements in years. That's how that executive director was caught. So, and then there was criminal liability, certainly for the executive director. And then there was, I'm not sure, criminal liability for the board, but there might have been, and there was huge fallout because there was a lot of debt. All right. I hope that was a useful example, but it can get pretty surprisingly challenging. Okay, so what are some of the consequences? Oh, I did that already. Sorry. So how should you go about doing your bylaws? It can seem a little overwhelming sometimes because, it's pages of documents, and where should we start? It's actually useful to review it on a regular basis. Every 2 years. You don't often, unless there's a lot of changes happening or changes in regulation, you don't often have to do it every year, but it's really helpful to actually set up a board committee and ask the board committee. And it doesn't have to be a standing committee. A standing committee is something that is created by the board and is always in existence. A standing committee is a committee that has a particular time frame and a particular task. So it could be that every other year you create a standing committee to take a look at the board bylaws and be familiar. Many regions have sort of a not-for-profit headquarters that helps advise nonprofits in your community. It's helpful to be get their newsletter or stay in touch with them, because they'll let you know if there's been changes at the state level for regulations and laws that would make it more urgent that you're taking that up immediately around your bylaws. And then so keep that up, set a particular time, look at what's changing, review your state laws, and then draft the amendment. And usually you have legal specialists involved, because as I said, this is by and large a legal process. That could be it could be that you have a lawyer, an attorney on your board. It could be that you're a member of a not-for-profit organization that supports nonprofit development, and you ask them, could you take a look at our amendment? Or could you send us some examples of other amendments that try to do what we're trying to do? So you don't have to start from scratch. And of course, now, all you have to do is a Google search for, I'm looking for an amendment on fill in the blank, and you'll have more examples than you know what to do with, but you don't have to start from scratch. And then a lot of people don't know this, but when you've amended your bylaws, because remember, it's a legal document, you must submit those amendments. So when you become a 501c3, you registered you got your 501c3 status from the IRS, and then typically there's a governmental agency that's a part of your state that you submit your bylaws to when you're sort of registering as a nonprofit business doing business in the state. And they should have a copy of any amendments to your bylaws. It's not something you do in a vacuum. Okay. So that's kind of an overview then of your bylaws, why you should do that. So now let's talk about one of my favorite topics, fundraising and the board. And I say that because many people find it's fraught with challenges. And I say that because there's so many, speaking just frankly, and I know I'm going to be talking to board members and executive directors here. There are so many executive directors who, out of earshot of their boards, we get whiny about our lack of board member involvement in fundraising. There are a lot of boards that think, oh, that's the executive director's job. They're doing such a good job. We don't need to bring in, we don't really have a role in that, do we? Well, the answer is yes. And the very rude shorthand that executive directors talk about, which we don't say in the hearing of board members, is give, get, or get off. Which means if you have the ability, and we'll talk more about this, I won't leave you with give, get, or get off, but if you have the ability, the financial resources to make a donation, that's great. If you can't, then you help raise money. And if you can't do either, maybe you should think about, joining, being involved in a different nonprofit where you would be willing to work to support the financial success of your organization. So how do you get the board to buy in? How do you get them excited? Well, that's really a good segue. You recruit board members who are passionate about your cause. I found a new voice when I became executive director of NAMI Texas, and I used to laugh that I would ask anybody for money. I would ask people I was sitting on the plane next to, I would say, oh, you work for a corporation, does it have a department to support giving and philanthropy? And I would just bring that up, but not everybody's that comfortable. And we'll talk in a minute about that. But the first step is recruit board members who are passionate about your cause, whatever that cause is. I have found in the world of peer recovery, both on the mental health and substance use side, that's not a challenge. I find remarkably passionate people who are really dedicated to working in this field. That's one of the reasons I love working in the field of peers. Provide clear expectations about what their role means, be clear about what it means, understand what their strengths and interests are. So somebody may have connections with, like in Texas, oil and gas. And so that's a strength because they're connected to organizations and families that have a lot of money. Somebody else may know how to throw a wonderful breakfast or luncheon and an event planner, or have connections for getting a fantastic speaker. Or there's so many different places and ways that people, somebody loves golf and they want to do a whole golf fundraiser for you. That's been popular in Texas. So bowling, just look to see who's at the table and what they love to do, and then support them in doing that with the goal of raising money. Now, and keeping fundraising at the front and center of every board meeting, that can be a little, it tends to slip into the background. And what I'm saying is, for the executive director, when the board chair and the executive director, typically that's how it works, gets together to formulate the agenda for every board meeting, always include as an agenda item, what you're doing to fundraise. It's easy if you don't have something really active, but just always include that, and then talk about to your board members, you know, meet, well, we'll talk about that when we do executive director and board chair, but find out what their strengths are and then meet with them and then see, is there something that makes it difficult for you to be a fundraiser? You know, maybe they need a script. Maybe they need to make those calls with you on the call and they pass it off to you. Maybe what they want to do is just make introductions and let you take it from there as the executive director. Look to see what they're comfortable, and then how to, you know, nobody knows how to do any of this, but you can provide the training and support that helps your board members. And, you know, you might find some unidentified stars, someone who falls in love with it, who finds out, boy, they're really effective. Last year they brought in $500 and this year it's $5,000. Let's see what we can do to help them increase that amount, and ask each board member to set a goal for themselves. Ask them to say, how much would you like to, we understand you're not in a position to donate a certain amount. And that it brings up an issue, which is the expectation that every board member will make a contribution. That is a reasonable expectation. As an executive director, when I'm asking funders to give me funds, you know, make a donation or as a foundation, one of the first questions they would ask me is, does everybody on your board member and on your board contribute? And I did have one person who wouldn't, and I said, please just give me $1. He just had he contributed in lots of other ways, and so he had some resistance about contributing, you know, currency. And I said, if you gave me $1, then I'm not lying when I say everybody on my board contributes, everybody. And so it's very nice. It gives the executive director a firm platform to stand on. And of course, like I said, they're not going to be able to give gifts. You know, we want a big, especially in the peer world, we want all parts of those we serve to be represented. And often the impact of mental illness and substance use has a serious impact, as you know, on people's financial resources. And so make it clear there's lots of ways to support your organization without making a certain amount. Now, I very much, and this is my personal opinion, oppose setting a dollar amount by which you must contribute if you're going to be on the board, because that eliminates a lot of people who are wonderful board members who just can't make a minimum donation. You know, there's so many other ways they can contribute. And the ED and CEO take the lead, you know, or the ED and the board chair take the lead in supporting and focusing on fundraising. And, you know, there's programs, some nonprofits have like an ambassador training program that helps you train the board member to tell an effective story, you know, and then they can be speakers at civic organizations and all over your community with an eye towards public relations and helping people understand what you do, as well as telling your story. And there's now, of course, you know, there's so many platforms through social media to do that very effectively as well, which really expands your impact and your reach. So one of the ways you can create a structure that really helps drive fundraising is to develop a fund development committee whose sole purpose is to lead the board's participation in resource development and fundraising. And so there's particular structures. You can work with the staff. In other words, you don't just say to the board, to the executive director, what's your fundraising plan this year? You know, you have a development committee that sits down with the executive director and your top management, and you look at what goals have you played, what did you say you were going to raise in the budget? What are the different activities that are going to raise that amount? What did you raise last year? Keeping them realistic. You know, I'm always amazed when someone says we're raising $1 million this year, and I ask them, well, what did you raise last year? And how did you do that? And then find that's an unrealistic goal. It would be wonderful if they could raise $1 million, but It's very unrealistic. And so having the board members work with the ED and work with the staff to set realistic goals is great. And then it's a joint effort. How do we reach those goals together? So you have, you should have a fundraising plan every year, just like you have your budget every year, have your fundraising plan. And then look to see who's going to do what by when. How are you going to review that? How are you going to keep the board informed about progress? The old thermometer that people used to put up where you'd put the little red line as you got more and more and more, that's somewhat outdated, but there's lots of other ways to get people excited about as you advance towards your goals and keep it a community-wide conversation. And then educate the board members, why do you mean you need $100,000? Why do you need $100,000? You've raised $500,000 in grants. What do you need that other money for? Well, it's a good question. Educate your board members about why, and help board members who may not understand the difference between restricted and unrestricted funds, what the difference is and why raising funds this way gives you some flexibility that you need in running your organization. And if you find you've got some seasoned board members who are willing to mentor new board members, pair them together and help that seasoned board member and fundraiser work with the new person to become more comfortable. And then keep in mind that there are some individuals, because of their profession or position, you might have a journalist or a judge, or I'm thinking of an organization I recently visited. They had a police chief on their board. They had legislative representatives on their board. That there's some limitations to the kind of fundraising they can do. It can be a conflict of interest or the appearance of a conflict of interest, which sometimes just the appearance of a conflict of interest is important to consider when you're involving some of those professions as board members and fundraising. They're invaluable, but just be aware of that perception. So I will say, just backing up, that one of the things that can be very, very helpful is to have a board orientation manual that spells out some of what these responsibilities are, what your guidelines are. You don't want board members going out and soliciting gifts without understanding that they can't accept a gift on their own individually. Sometimes that can have a huge impact and it's not a positive one. Just because it's a gift doesn't mean it's a good gift for you. So evaluate gifts that are offered, have the board review it, take it to the development committee, have the development committee discuss it with the finance committee. Take a moment to think about what the implications of the gift are. Your board employee manual will help guide your board, and provide some ongoing training about fundraising to your board so that they become more comfortable and familiar with what your policies and procedures are. Okay, let's talk about, let me check my time. I think I'm doing okay. Let's talk about executive director and board chair relationship. So raise your hand if you've ever seen some difficult situations between executive directors and board chairs. I wish it was true that that was never the issue, because when the relationship works well, it's magical, and when the relationship isn't working well, it's tragic. Almost, it makes for sleepless nights for the executive director, and it makes for sleepless nights for the board chair and for the whole board. So what is it? What could we do to try and, ensure that it's a positive relationship? I would say one of the key factors is sort of staying in your lane, understanding each other's roles. I've seen that be an issue often, and to be honest, it's often the board chair that has challenges staying in their lane. So there's something called founder syndrome, for example. And founder syndrome is when, and we see that a lot because in the peer world, or I say I should, because people are passionate. It's part of their passion, right? And, a group of people in a grassroots level, they get together, they form an organization to address substance use or mental health or overdose it, whatever the issue is, to make a difference in their community. And these group of people to come together, they found the organization, they move it forward into the next stage of development. They're hiring staff, they're growing, they're doing a great job. But founder syndrome is that the people who founded the organization, who were instrumental in getting that organization established, have a hard time letting go. And often because they were involved with the daily operations of running that organization, they want to remain involved in running the daily operations of that organization. What do I mean by that? Well, I don't know. I've always been involved. I'm pretending now to be like a founding member. I've always had a say in who we hired. I've always had a say in, HR. I've always had a say in how we do A, B, or C, that has to do with daily operations. Well, once you hire an executive director, you're as a board chair in a healthy organization, you are taking a big step back and staying in your lane, which means you've hired someone you now entrust to make the decisions for daily operation. You're not showing up at the office every day. And I'm talking from personal examples where I've seen that happen in organizations because they love the organization. It's their baby. It's very hard to let it go, but it's critical to the health of your organization moving forward developmentally. So you have good boundaries. You understand what your roles are. You've provided some training to the chair. You provided some training, and it's not uncommon in our world, a peer world and behavioral health world, where let's say I'm the founder, I'm the chair of the board, it comes time to hire an executive director, and I say I'll be the executive director, which is great. But now you're off the board. Now you are a staff person answering to the board. So you need to know what your role is, and just as much as the chair needs to know what their role is if you're going to move your organization forward in a functional, effective way. So now let's talk about good communication. One of the best advice that I've ever received is, and I think it's good, is the board chair and the executive director should get together for like lunch or coffee once a month. Take it outside of just the board meeting and have a chance to just develop a relationship, and a relationship that's based on trust, respect, and support. But it doesn't guarantee that you'll have good communication, but it moves things forward. And then maybe talk about it. I've heard board chairs say, well, they never talk to me. And I'll say, well, how often are you communicating with the executive director? Every other day. So get on the same page about what your board chair's expectations are and what your executive director has time. I mean, I know one organization, I bet you she talks to her board chair 3 times a day. I don't think that's functional. You're so busy trying to answer the board chair's questions, you can hardly do your job. But get an agreement, talk about it. How often do you want to hear from me? Maybe I give you a summary every Friday, or maybe is texting okay? Is it you prefer phone calls, or I should send you emails, or because of course you're going to have an executive director's report for the board whenever the board is meeting, your monthly, quarterly. which is a great way to provide an overview of what your activities are. Come to some agreement about how you're going to communicate with each other. And then make a commitment to creating a positive work environment. That's created by both of you, both the chair and the executive director. Have a conversation. What does a positive work environment look like to me? You know, like, for example, I don't want to be micromanaged as an executive director. And I can say, so when they say, well, I want to hear from you every day. Well, that would actually, I would feel like that was micromanagement. Can we come to an agreement about a different schedule of communication? So just to go over some of those issues. So the board chair is doing the big picture, helps the organization succeed, sees the big picture, helps the organization fulfill its mission, strategic planning, fundraising, environmental scans, looking at, what's happening that the board chair may have some access to, that the ED might not. The executive director oversees day-to-day operations, administration, generates a marketing strategy, does program development and implementation, works towards the goals of the strategic plan, and keeps the board informed about all of that. It seems clear. I just can tell you that it often gets muddy. Even though there's sort of a clarity in terms of best practices and what that would actually look like. So to ensure these two roles stay on the same page, again, meet regularly. The ED should be included in all board meetings. Remember, they're not on the board, but they should be included. And to act as a source of truth for what's happening on a day-to-day. And then the board should conduct an annual performance evaluation of the executive director and conduct an annual performance evaluation of themselves, the board. How'd we do? There's some boards that do an evaluation of every meeting. They have a little cheat sheet. They look at it. They ask, did we stay on task? Was this a productive meeting? What could we do to make it more effective? There are little templates out there for sort of ongoing board meeting evaluation, and then take a step back every year. What were the goals that we set? Here's the strategic planning goals we set. Here's the committee work that we set. Here's the fundraising goals that we set. How'd we do? Let's rate ourselves. Let's evaluate ourselves. And when you're evaluating the executive director, no executive director wants to be surprised by their evaluation. You should know, you should be communicating well enough that if there's an issue you have with the executive director, you should be talking to that executive director about that. And the executive director should be very clear about what they're being evaluated on. It's like I've seen where that goes badly awry. Yeah, board members don't like surprises either. No, that's why the communication is so important. As the executive director, if there's trouble coming down the pike, don't keep it a secret. Talk to your board chair. Oh, I'm hearing rumors about, or we have a staff person and there may be a scandal now. I just found out that, they were arrested and, make sure your board isn't surprised, and your board chair, and ask your board chair, what do you think we should do? You should have a risk management plan, but that's not on today's topic. And who's the spokesperson and all that kind of stuff. But nobody likes surprises. But about performance evaluation, the URD should be very clear about what their goals are all year. And those goals should be reflected in your performance evaluation. Don't sort of go off on a tangent and decide you're going to evaluate them on something that wasn't made clear from the January 1st or fiscal year, whatever, so that everyone's very clear about what you're going to be evaluating on, and then give a truthful evaluation. Everybody would appreciate that. And there's also something called a 360, which is we're not going to have time to talk about. But that's where you actually are asking your whole community, how'd your ED do? How'd you do? How'd you do? How's he occurring in the community? It can be a little uncomfortable for the ED, but there's a lot of benefit to it, especially in the work we do. You want to know, how are they doing out in the community? So let's talk about board development and the organization's life cycle. So one of my favorite books is by Judith Sharkin Simon, and she writes about the 5 life stages of nonprofit development. We're talking about 4. The others are sort of what happens when the organization is sort of in a downward spiral. But for today's purposes, we're going to be talking about, one moment, please. The nonprofit, we're going to focus on just the board development for these 5 life stages. So for nonprofit governance stages of development, in a grassroots stage, it's invention. The boards are not really even created yet. It's not really a concern. You're really at the very early stages where you're sitting down over a cup of coffee and someone says, you know what, we should start a nonprofit. Because we have this gap in our community, or this, this public health, the opioid overdose epidemic is happening, and we really need to be more effective. Whatever, we don't have mental health services in our community. We don't have peer services in our community. We don't have substance use peer-based services. We want to get something going. So that's really
Looks like maybe we lost our presenter. So we'll pause here. Brian, are you able to see what's going on?
I'm on it.
Thank you. Meantime, I'll just say that my head is getting tired of nodding because I keep nodding in agreement with her. It's like, yes, 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 I've been there. So I really appreciate that. It's always nice when the presenter really resonates with experiences that you have, right? So that's awesome. And just know that we are collecting your questions, and we'll go over those at the end. So just know that we still have those, and I'll make sure that we cover those today if there's enough time, which I think there will be. Hopefully we can get our presenter back. And if she jumps on at any point while I'm talking, just know I'm going to stop, is what I'm saying. But in the meantime, I'll answer the first question, but I still will ask her because she may have a different take or something to add. And again, if she jumps on at any time, I'm just going to stop and let her take over. The first question was, do you need to be subject to Brown's Act and also Robert's Rules of Order? Brown's Act is as a membership organization, and Brown's Act is specifically for the state of California. We decided not to cover that today because it was so much content. But just know that your bylaws should say whether you're a membership organization, which means members that typically pay dues, they vote on certain things for your organization. So that's something, again, you want to check your bylaws to see if you're required to do that. Your board hopefully is aware because they need to follow that and get certain quorum of membership voting to make certain decisions like voting and who's president and vice president of the board. And Robert Rules of Orders is not required, but it's just very much standard practice of how people make decisions or how they discuss things in board meetings. And I'll just touch on Roberta's Rules of Order, just like the presenter was saying, that I have the book. It's embarrassing. One of those things, I have the book, but I haven't read it. But it's really fascinating because it's sort of giving a modern, more inclusive way of managing and having board meetings. So just recommend, if you're curious about it, to purchase the book and not like me, read it so you can learn about it. Because again, it's just another take of how to conduct your board meetings. Let's see here. The next one, again, I'll stop whenever she jumps on. So just know I'm happy to hand it back over to her. Is the chair responsible for following these processes? I think that she touched on the consequences, that perhaps the chair could be found responsible if it's not being followed. And this was regarding the bylaws. I think it's more as a whole, the board is responsible. But the key thing as executive director is that you inform the board. So hopefully the executive director, because it's their paid position, to become fully aware of the bylaws, to be very familiar with them and provide the guidance, because the board may not, one, have access to the bylaws, which should be in your board orientation packet. And second, they may not know how to interpret that. What does that mean? If they've never run a nonprofit before. So really the ED needs to be that person that says, here's what this means. we're supposed to be doing this. And then the board is responsible for implementing the bylaws. This was a great question. She was mentioning about agencies that you can reach out to for best practices around the bylaws. And the one that I've always used when it was our insurance company. If many of you have NIAC, they may raise their hand if you have NIAC. Great organization. Great. William, I see you raise your hand. Nia, awesome. That was awesome. I would just turn to them. Our insurance companies, I think they have so much wealth of experience or expertise. And of course, they want us to be on best practices. So I reach out to them first to see if they have it. And if not, sometimes our communities have nonprofit resource centers. They're sort of a dying breed. I used to work for one, but sometimes there's nonprofit resource centers. I know there's one, there used to be one in Sacramento. Hopefully it's still around. But organizations like that definitely are sort of a hub for nonprofit management. I think I mentioned the difference between Robert's Rules of Orders and Roberta's Rules of Orders. So again, Roberta's is just like a more modern version because Robert's Rules of Orders is a little old school, but it still works. So again, I would just research and see which one is best for your organization, and of course, include the board in that process. Next question is, and again, Brian, please stop me when you see the presenter coming on back on. Yes.
Rachel, this is Tammy. Robin's in the chat, so I don't know if she's able. Robin, are you able to unmute and speak?
No. Are they?
There she is.
There you are.
There you are.
I could hear everybody. Just the screen went blank, and then when I came back, I was disappeared. So thank you for whatever magic you worked to get me back in. Thanks. Okay. All right. And thanks, Rachel, for filling in. I appreciate it. So these are the stages of development. This is specifically what the board should be doing. And I was so busy trying to get back in, I couldn't hear what you covered already, Rachel. So I don't want to repeat it. But this is just lets you know these are particular tasks the board should be completing. So just take a moment and think about what stage is my organization at. You can get this book from Amazon or directly from her website, Judith Shark and Simon. It's chock full of information, including how to evaluate where you are as an organization. And in addition to looking at board, it's looking at every single aspect of running a nonprofit and what should you be doing at those different stages, HR, fiscal, marketing. So this is just a slice of that information, but you can see that the tasks are different. So these are tasks by stages. And so as grassroots, you're starting to think about, and I know if you've been doing this for 5 years, you're not so interested in grassroots and startup because you're likely to be an adolescent or mature. Although I worked with organizations that have been nonprofits for 20 years, and because of changing leadership and management, and they're back to incubation. They're back to a much earlier stage, or they never actually progressed in terms of infrastructure and organizational decision making. But what could you do if you were in that adolescent stage? Conduct board retreats for planning and training. Identify, do an assessment. What do your board members need to be trained in? How do you formalize board recruitment processes? Have you ever been sitting in a board meeting where someone comes back in and says, "Great news, I found this wonderful new board member and I've asked him to join the board," and nobody on the board has ever met this person? You don't really know who they are. You don't know if it's a good fit. Oh, he's my cousin, or he's my accountant, or having a very clear recruitment process so that you don't have people they're super excited. They don't mean to be doing anything that has a negative impact, but it could, because then the board, this is the worst case scenario. The board meets that person, and then they say, "We don't want that person on the board." Then someone has to go back and tell that person, "Thank you so much for your interest, but we're not approving you to be on the board," which is not an experience I want anybody to have. And it's very clear, and I know we talked about this, what's a board recruitment strategy. Identify who are you missing. And that's critical for peer organizations. Who are your marginal populations visited one place where they were misreading the demographic data. They thought they only had a few percentages of the Hispanic population in their community, which is very far north. But it actually was 7 to 8%. So that's look to see. You should know what the demographics are. Now I sound I'm lecturing, I'm sorry. Be curious about what the demographics are in your community and use those demographics to inform you about who should be on your board for appropriate diversity. And that's for gender, that's for gender identity, that's for all the little checklists of who you want, different pathways to recovery. Is everybody on your board a 12-step only? But you're supporting all pathways to recovery. Develop board orientation and a mentoring program. It's wonderful having a great board orientation manual. It's one of my favorite things to create. Shift the focus towards policy development in adolescent. And then when you're mature, institute an annual board evaluation. You might not be ready for that until you're kind of well established. You want your board members happy to be there, excited, interested. So those are tasks by stages. So now we're coming to an end. I think I'm almost pretty much on time. And I think we're going to turn it over for questions and answers. So you should now know something about your organization's bylaws and when should you be updating them and why, and what's your sort of time frame. You should be thinking about what steps. Take a minute, jot down some ideas. What steps should you take in your organization to improve your fundraising? What steps can you take in your organization right now that you want to go back and discuss with your board, or go back and discuss with your ED, or have the board and ED visit about how can we improve our relationships? What's some ideas? Even if it's on a scale of 1 to 10, and you would say your relationship is at a 10, shoot for 11. What could make it even better? That would be the best of all possible outcomes, that you could make it even better. And then think about, well, what stage are we at? And what could we be doing that we're not? How can we be looking forward to growing an effective board for the stage of development we're in? So that's pretty much what we talked about. It went by very fast.
Thank you so much, Robin. It did. And I was saying earlier when you hopped off for briefly, my head was tired of nodding because I was just so much like, yes, yes, yes. So thank you.
You're
Wonderful
welcome.
presentation. So I did go over some of the questions in the Q&A. So what I'm going to do is actually touch on the ones that I didn't get to. And if there's time, we'll see if you have anything to add for the other ones. But let's start with, would you encourage or discourage writing into the bylaws that board members must contribute financially to the nonprofit, specifically personally contribute versus bringing in from outside donors?
I would simply, I would not be specific. Maybe if you are going to say something, just say, we do it. We do want board members to make a financial contribution that aligns with their financial resources. So that gives you the freedom that if someone can give you $1, that's great. No shame, no blame, but that they understand that their help would be appreciated. And I know people who, especially now with social media and Facebook and all the different avenues, maybe they can create a crowdfunding ask, or maybe they can say, what I want for my birthday. And I see this a lot. I know you have. If everybody would give me $10, or you have a party and the entrance is $20, for your backyard barbecue. And there's so many different ways, but help that person who wants to make a contribution. So it's up to you. I would make it clear that a financial contribution is expected, but that it's really tied into what and if you're lucky enough to have a millionaire on your board, that they would give accordingly. That would be great of all possible outcomes.
Thank you, Robin.
Does that answer the question? I think
I don't know who asked that, but if people want to raise their hands as a follow-up question, please do. But just keep in mind that we have about 8 minutes left.
Oh, someone just said, I'd like to ask for an amount that is significant to them. Yeah, I like that phrase. That's very nice.
The next question, would you encourage or discourage, I read that one. Next question, sorry. Do you consider board members who are donating considerable amounts of volunteer work or free professional services to organization as giving?
Yes. And you actually can value that. You can actually put a dollar value. So let's say you have an attorney who's donating free services or an accountant who's donating free services. There's actually regulations about how to value the dollar amount. So let's say your attorney is charging $500 an hour, which some attorneys charge $500 an hour, and they're donating, X number of hours to you. You get to track that, and you can value that when you're showing the support that you get from your community. You can say board members have volunteered services worth X number of dollars. And so that's actually a valuable way of telling the story of the kind of support you get in your community, an accountant, any professional. And then there's actually a dollar amount for just general volunteer work, and you can actually attach a dollar amount to any general. So there's all these different categories depending on what professional expertise is involved. Marketing, social media, website design, those have real great value. Absolutely would count it.
Great. The next one was and this one I attempted to answer, but if there's anything you want to add, what's the difference between Robert's rules and Roberta's rules of order? You sort of touched on this, but do you want to add anything else to differentiate?
I think probably, Rachel, you can answer that better than I, because I had, until we were meeting to prepare for today, I had never heard of Roberta's rules of order. And then I was fascinated by the story of Roberta, which I encourage you to go look up if you're interested. But it's simply a way of saying, you know what, we could run this meeting effectively without being so rigid. And that's kind of nice because it really is helpful to have an agreed upon set of rules about how the meeting is going to run. But as times have changed, Robert's rules of order get a little cumbersome.
Thank you. I think it's better
Would you
than
add
what I
anything
said.
to that?
No, just that I have the book and I haven't read it. So that was much better. Thank you. The next one, you were talking about organizations that you could turn to for resources on best practices with regards to bylaws. Did you have any that you can recommend? I mentioned like NIAC. So oftentimes your insurance company might have some, examples, but is there anyone that you can mention?
I put in at the end, there's a whole list of links to different organizations that I visited that I liked. But like, Texas has what you want to find who's doing it in your state. It's different enough. Don't assume just that California is the same as Texas is the same as whatever state. I know most of you all are in California. So I would look for, an association for nonprofits, and there'll be something like that in California that will have clear recommendations on what your elements should be. And if you've been around for a while and you haven't looked at them, it's very hard. It can be very hard to find the time. As the ED, I was executive director of an organization that had been in creation for a while. And I kept thinking, I will get to that. And then when I finally did get to it, it was a real wake-up call because it had been written many years prior to my looking at it. And it was sorely in need of rewriting. Even the recovery, even if you just look at the language we now use in recovery, just having bylaws that reflect the recovery language is important. All your documents, now I'll preach really beyond my soapbox, all your documents should reflect recovery language, including your bylaws.
Great point, Robin. Thank you. The next question was, is the chair responsible for following these processes? And this was regarding the bylaws.
Absolutely.
Is it the chair responsible? Okay.
And it's really the the chair should be leading every board meeting, not the executive director. They can pass over whatever they want, and but the board is run by the board chair, and they absolutely should be following their own policies and procedures. And if they're not, then that gets into the sort of risk management liability issues, depending on the nature of the decisions that are being made. But if you're making any decisions that have a financial implication, it's very important you be following your own policies, procedures.
And then the last one we have here is, do we need to be subject to Brown's Act, also Robert Rules of Order?
Well, and that's where I'm afraid I'm not familiar with the Brown's Act. And maybe that's something that Rachel can pick up, and we sort of discussed whether we would include it or not, but I don't want to pretend to I know something when I don't. So Brown's Act is
Robin,
particular to California.
It is, thank you. Yeah, and I mentioned it's a membership type organization, and they need to see if they're that type because it does have requirements for voting. So thank you. But I also said about Robert Rules of Order, it's not required, it's just very standard. Is there anything else you want to add about that?
No, if you're not going to use Robert's Rules of Order, because I mean, I think they were developed in England, and they're like parliamentary procedure. And so there's, I make a motion, I move. Most of those parliamentary procedures are not something that is used. It's simply I make a motion and it's seconded. But it's really important that so this is not on today's topic, but did you know that you are required by the IRS to take contemporaneous minutes of your board meetings? Contemporaneous. That means you cannot go back and recreate them and say you have minutes that are in compliance with the IRS. But you want to keep track of who said what. You don't have to say William made the motion and Robin seconded it, but you do have to say a motion was made and seconded, and it needs to be written down in order for you to be in compliance with your IRS. So if you're not going to use Robert's Rules of Order, then you need to have some other agreed upon structure for how you run your meetings and who makes motions and who interrupts and what happens. It's as usual, it's all fine until the poop hits the fan, and then you're like, oh, now what? So that's why it's really nice to have the structure in place before, somebody's in a huge disagreement. Sometimes you see those coming, but sometimes you don't.
Great. So that was all the questions, and we are at time. So Robin, once again, thank you so much for that excellent presentation, covering such a wealth of expertise and knowledge. I'm just so appreciative of that because I know it's a lot of really helpful information. Are there any remaining questions before we move on to the surveys, which are now in the chat? Okay, let's go ahead and bring those up. Again, they're in the chat as well. Here are the resources that will be available on the slides. Oh, and I don't have the links, but they're in the chat. My apologies. So just know that those links for both the attendance survey and the feedback are in the chat. So please do use those before you go, so we know that you were here. And we definitely welcome your feedback, which we'll share with the presenter. So once again, Robin, thank you so much. We'll stay on.
It was my pleasure. Hope this was useful information for all of you and leads to better board meetings and better effective organizations. Thanks.
Great.
And step back.
Nina, I see you have your hand raised.
Thank you.
Hi, yes, I just was wondering, is it possible to get a TTA with Robin or anyone in the organization?
Yes, just go ahead. Yeah, that's great. Fill out the grantee request form and reach out to your grantee coach if you need that link. You can fill out that form and you can reference this presentation and say that you need additional support and hopefully specify what it is so that we can prepare on our end of what that would look like. And then we can explore from there to see if that's a fit. That's great.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions or last minute items? All right, we'll stay on just for a little bit more so you can access those links. Thank you everyone for joining today.